Alrighty, so what we're going to be looking at today, as it says here, is an introduction and contextualization of Harriet Jacobs's Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. So this is obviously the best known 19th century African American woman's autobiography. And let me tell you what we're not going to do in this video lecture, first of all. So this is not a summary of the slave narrative. This is not an analysis of it, nor is it a summary of Harriet Jacobs's life. What we're going to do here is look literally at the contextualization of the initial publication of the book in 1861. Talk a little bit about people that she was in contact with, other important people in the publishing world: Lydia Maria Child, Harriet Beecher Stowe, Nathaniel Parker Willis, and so it's going to serve two things. Number one, we're going to really look into the initial circumstances of her writing the book and publishing it, and then secondly, what we're going to do here, I'm hoping also that overall what this video does is help to catalyze an interest. So if you've never read Harriet Jacobs before, or if you've only read just a short excerpt or something like that, maybe for an AP high school literature course or something like that, really what this video should do is not only give you an introduction to the book itself, but also help you to just prepare you to enjoy it. So there we go. So what I'm going to start with is real super foundational here, which is just to make sure that we are on the same page as far as using the correct terms for literary prose. This book, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl by Harriet Jacobs, is not a novel. Don't call it a novel. And if you're a college student writing a paper about it, don't write in the novel, blah, blah, blah. A novel is a work of fiction. It's made up. This is not made up. This is true. So it's a work of nonfiction. So it's not a novel. It's nonfiction. It's also autobiography. Some autobiography is also referred to as a memoir, which this could be referred to as that too. Memoir just being a type of autobiography that especially deals with the author's childhood and maybe, one or two particular themes. So, for example, in memoir, one of my favorite memoirs is Annie Dillard's An American Childhood. And in that, there's a sort of theme that Dillard touches on. It's almost like you're recreating your past in some way or noticing things about your past and your childhood. In a memoir, for Dillard, that's self-awareness. When a memoir is also a slave narrative, as this is, then obviously the most important theme is going to be the escape to freedom. A second very common theme in a slave narrative is the acquisition of literacy. That's not as pronounced in Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl because Harriet Jacobs explains that she learned to read and write when she was a little girl between the ages of 6 and 11. And she had an owner at that time, her mistress, that Jacobs describes early on in the book in pleasant terms and loving terms, frankly. And so the acquisition of literacy, which is usually a pretty strong theme in slave narratives, is not in this. So, so what we're going to do here, so I have in that second bullet point that I'm going to turn and just read a little short excerpt. I'm going to read two excerpts in this by a woman who is a professor at Princeton University. Her name is Nell Irvin Painter. And this little excerpt describes the sort of relationship very, very briefly between Harriet Jacobs and Harriet Beecher Stowe. And then we're actually going to talk just a little bit more about Harriet Beecher Stowe in just a moment. So again, this is Nell Irvin Painter, who is a history professor at Princeton University. And she's just explaining here in the in the early 1850s, she's explaining when Harriet Jacobs had been freed at that point, had been living in the North for about a decade. And Professor Painter is describing the brief and not productive relationship between Harriet Jacobs and Harriet Beecher Stowe. So, lacking formal education, Harriet Jacobs initially doubted her ability as a writer to strike the right balance between candor and prurient detail. She thought first to dictate her experience to someone more comfortable with writing for publication, as Sojourner Truth had to Olive Gilbert in the 1840s. The best-selling author of Uncle Tom's Cabin struck Jacobs as a potential amanuensis, but Harriet Beecher Stowe saw in Jacobs only grist for her own mill. She asked to print the whole of Jacobs's experiences in her Key to Uncle Tom's Cabin, but Jacobs allowed her only a brief sketch. Stowe not only sought to appropriate Jacobs's material, she also sent Jacobs's letter, containing details about her sexual history, to Jacobs's employer, without Jacobs's permission. That would be Nathaniel Parker Willis, who we'll talk about briefly in a few minutes as well. Jacobs, perhaps naively, had also proposed to Stowe that Louisa, that's Harriet Jacobs's daughter, accompany Stowe on a trip to England. Stowe's patronizing refusal offended Jacobs. Deeply chagrined, Jacobs decided to become an author in her own right. The death of her grandmother in 1853 removed the last obstacle to her writing her own story, quote, by herself. So again, that's Nell Irvin Painter of Princeton University describing basically, and the reason I wanted to read that is to understand how Jacobs, who by 1853, when she begins to write the manuscript that will later be published as Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, is well read, very well read, and had spent time with a great number of abolitionists. Her and her brother had lived in Rochester, New York at that time. Harriet Jacobs herself had actually lived with Amy Post. They were both friends with Frederick Douglass. Harriet Jacobs's brother toured with Frederick Douglass. So, but what Professor Painter points out, which I think is good, is that still, sort of lacking a little self-confidence, Jacobs reached out to Harriet Stowe, and it was not a fruitful communication between them. Now, so I'm going to talk for just a moment about Harriet Beecher Stowe, and part of the reason I'm going to do this also is because I like to occasionally discuss or just touch on momentarily the idea of canon formation, meaning how and why are certain works of literature put on a college syllabus. And I've done that earlier with a little sort of side discussion of Anne Bradstreet and Michael Wigglesworth, the Puritan poets from the 17th century. And so I'm going to do that just a moment now, too, with the two Harriets, Harriet Jacobs and Harriet Beecher Stowe. So, so first of all, let me just kind of talk for a moment about Harriet Beecher Stowe, who came, as it says in bullet point number 1, from a family of ministers. Harriet Beecher Stowe's father, Lyman Beecher, was a very, very well-known minister in the early 1800s, and in fact, one of the key figures in what's referred to historically as the Second Great Awakening. And actually, I refer briefly to Lyman Beecher and the Second Great Awakening in a lecture about Ralph Waldo Emerson and the emergence of transcendentalism in the 1830s. So, Harriet Beecher Stowe had a very large, her father, Lyman, had, I think, 13 children. And Stowe and her sisters, as it says there, taught, wrote, and championed women's education. They were strong abolitionists. The actual Beecher family, her brothers and sisters, many of her brothers were ministers, and her sisters, so they were Calvinists, and it's sort of explaining Harriet Beecher Stowe's politics and religious ideals are kind of complicated because she was very, very strong Christian her whole life. She was also progressive in certain ways. Her sister was one of the first founders of what would become basically a women's college. And so, anyway, but the family, including Harriet Beecher Stowe, were strong abolitionists. And Uncle Tom's Cabin, so this novel, which we're going to talk about for a few minutes here. Uncle Tom's Cabin was first published serially in 1851 and 1852, I believe, in a Washington, D.C. based anti-slavery journal. So 1851. And then the novel itself comes out in 1852, Uncle Tom's Cabin. And we'll talk just a little bit about how impressive, it's really unparalleled, the amount of the publication and the amount of readers that Uncle Tom's Cabin had. Sold about 3,000 copies on its first day. Worldwide, within a year, there were more than 1 million copies of Uncle Tom's Cabin in print. It became the best-selling novel of the decade prior to the Civil War. So again, it was published in 1852. And then it says remarked upon perhaps by Abraham Lincoln, because there is no doubt that Uncle Tom's Cabin was by far, the most important anti-slavery novel, and it was a great catalyst for the abolitionist movement. So much so that, and now this little comment here, I thought I'd mention this, and it used to be taken as fact, but when historians recently have done the research into this, it wasn't, I think, written down until several years after the meeting. But supposedly, so there's no doubt that Uncle Tom's Cabin was this huge, like I said, catalyst for the abolitionist movement. So much so that supposedly when Abraham Lincoln met Harriet Jacobs later, when Abraham Lincoln met Harriet Beecher Stowe later, he supposedly said to her on his very first meeting, "So, you're the little woman who started this great big war," meaning that, that was the impact of Uncle Tom's Cabin. So, in less than a decade after its publication, it had been translated into 22 languages. Now it says there at the bottom it has a very complicated legacy, which we're going to get to in just a moment. So, but I wanted to get back to what I said a minute ago about speaking about canon formation. So, when I first taught English 209 at the University of Alabama a decade ago, it was pretty common still then to have a selection by Harriet Beecher Stowe, have a little bit of Uncle Tom's Cabin, and to read that in a college class. And it's becoming less and less so. And in some ways, maybe Harriet Jacobs has probably displaced Harriet Beecher Stowe's, positioning on a syllabus. So there's a couple of reasons for that. Now, one might argue that because Uncle Tom's Cabin was so immensely popular that one should still read it. One could argue against that and say that, we should be reading Harriet Jacobs' Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl for issues of diversity and inclusivity. Either one of those arguments might be valid. Another final thing, which is important, is to just think about what's the quality of the literary work. And Uncle Tom's Cabin is kind of flat. The characters are pretty shallow. There's no other way to get around it. It's kind of boring to read. It's a huge novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin. And like I said, the characters are a little bit flat. And so for that, if we were to reduce it to the simplicity of, well, what literary work has more merits? And I would argue strongly in favor of Jacobs's Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. Now, it says at the bottom there that Uncle Tom's Cabin has a very complicated legacy. So let's talk about that for just a moment. So those first few bullet points are things that I already went over. Now, I said a moment ago that the characters themselves are kind of flat in Uncle Tom's Cabin. The story is a little bit boring. It's a little long, and it's not a thrilling and fun read. It's more like if you're an English major, you might, be required or have a desire to read it. But it gets a little worse than that. So we look at the last two bullet points. So Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin definitely contains, there's no other way to put it than racial stereotypes. Things like, the affectionate dark-skinned mammy, pickaninny black children, and Tom himself, who, we now have the term in Uncle Tom specifically because of this book. Going further than that, going much decades later, so it's published in 1852, Civil War ends in 1865, and for decades after the Civil Wars ended, Uncle Tom, what were called Uncle Tom's shows, were very popular all through the nation, and they were racist. Many of them were sort of combined with minstrel shows, so there were lax copyright laws, and so in the late 19th century, and so theaters would put on these basically minstrel shows where white actors were wearing blackface and acting out little scenes from Uncle Tom's Cabin, and in many cases not even acting out scenes from the novel itself, but the novel had been so important that people knew a few of the most important characters, and so these were, like I said, the novel itself. It's the reason I say it's got a complicated legacy is because on the one hand, there was no novel, there was no book that did more for the abolitionist movement than Uncle Tom's Cabin, but at the same time, when we go decades further down, it spawned these very racist minstrel shows. So very complicated legacy there. So as we talked about a few minutes ago, Harriet Jacobs initially tried to reach out to Harriet Beecher Stowe, and that did not prove well. And that's better because that happened right at the time that Harriet Jacobs' grandmother died, who we'll get to at the end of this video lecture, and who, as you begin reading the book, you'll see immediately that she's one of the most important characters certainly in the first half of the book itself. So she's sort of rebuffed in some ways by Harriet Beecher Stowe, or Harriet Beecher Stowe actually didn't rebuff her, she just tried to appropriate the material, and Jacobs chose not to. So 1853, Jacobs writes Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. She is, as it says there, living with and working for Nathaniel Parker Willis. So let's talk about him for just a moment. So Nathaniel Parker Willis was, at this time, so he is Harriet Jacobs' employer. She is his nanny. She takes care of his children. Nathaniel Parker Willis is wealthy, and he is also a very well-known and very well-paid writer. Nathaniel Parker Willis comes from a publishing family. His father was a newspaper publisher. His grandfather was, and his father was. Nathaniel Parker Willis himself founded a magazine. At the time it was called the Home Journal. I believe it's still, last I checked, that magazine that Nathaniel Parker Willis himself created, the Home Journal, later renamed Town and Country. So Nathaniel Parker Willis, very, very popular, very well-paid writer in the mid-19th century. Not interesting to read his work at all now, believe me. And so there's just a little bit of irony in the fact that everyone in the literary community knew this man in the 1850s. Everybody knew him. He got paid a lot of money for his work. And his employee, his nanny, was secretly, Nathaniel Parker Willis did not know it. Jacobs was keeping it a secret from him. Jacobs was in his home raising his children and writing her manuscript, her autobiography. And that's what is read now. So one of the strange ironies of life. So she finishes. It takes her about 5 years to write this. She finishes writing it in 1858. She has a daughter who we'll see in Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. She has a daughter named Louisa, and Louisa copies the manuscript. Louisa's received a formal education, and she copies her mother's manuscript down, standardizes the spelling, punctuation, etc. In 1859, Harriet Jacobs tries to get it published in England. That doesn't work. In 1860, she tries to get the book published in Boston, and she's rejected in both England and in Boston. She's rejected for, we're going to talk just a moment about publishing, and she's rejected for a kind of a simple reason that makes sense financially then and even financially now in 2021. and that was that the people who read it, the publishers who read it, didn't think that she had a readership and that it wouldn't sell well. One of those publishers said to Harriet Jacobs, if you can get this famous woman that we're going to talk about in just a moment, named Lydia Maria Child, if you can get Lydia Maria Child to edit this and basically blurb it, because Lydia Maria Child is famous, then we'll be able to sell it. So then you can publish it. So Harriet Jacobs is put in contact with Lydia Maria Child. So we'll talk about her for just a moment, because this is a really wonderful part of the story. So, alrighty. So we have when she was born then. So she was born to a strict Calvinist family in a suburb of Boston. In 1821, Lydia Maria Child decided to become a Unitarian. She married she was very, very politically progressive. She married a fellow abolitionist in 1828, and she preferred to be called by her Maria, so L. Maria Child. Now, Maria Child, as it says there in that bullet point, had an enormously productive literary and editing career. Over the course of over 5 decades, she published over 40 books, and Maria Child was publishing in all facets of newspaper, magazine, literary publishing, and was also an editor too, published regular columns in different newspapers, literary journals. She just was incredibly, amazingly productive. Now, like I said, she was also very politically progressive. A great deal of her writings have to do with women's rights, with abolitionism, and so she was the choice to get Maria Child to work as the editor on the manuscript for Harriet Jacobs turned out to be perfect, literally perfect, and here's why. So first of all, Maria Child I think it was her very first novel that she published. She was able to take on provocative ideas and themes that were deemed scandalous. Maria Child, I think it was her first novel, had a Native American man who was married to a white woman. So imagine that I think that would have been in the 1820s. So when she came on as editor, what she did, so I put there in the last bullet point that Maria Child, as an editor, she had a light touch. She just did a little bit of slight reorganization, and she allowed Jacobs' own voice to be the foundation. So I want to explain that for just a moment. So a good editor, whether it's in 1860 or 2021, a good editor for a good writer, an editor is probably just going to do, if they're really good, then they're not going to appear to have done a whole lot, but in effect they will. And Maria Child was one of those. So she just suggested, first of all, what often happens, especially when someone is writing autobiography, is toward the end of literally anybody who's writing their autobiography, usually toward the end of it, they go off digress in ways that are maybe a little bit problematic for the reader. And you can notice that in lots of you might not notice it, because if the editor was good, they would have helped the writer to change that or cut some off. So that's what Maria Child did. She suggested that that Harriet Jacobs cut the final chapter, which she did, and end it on the current chapter that you'll read, which is just this beautiful ending to the story and flawless last paragraph where Harriet Jacobs is reflecting on her mother. So beautiful. But anyway, so Maria Child suggested that she cut a final chapter, which was probably a good idea. Harriet Jacobs complied with that. Then there was some slight reorganization. So there's a chapter in the book, it might be chapter 9, sketches of neighboring slaveholders, chapter 9, and that was a chapter which Maria Child had suggested that Harriet Jacobs take these little different pieces from that were scattered in the book and then shift them and create a new chapter and put them all together there. And what we would call that today, just in publishing or creative writing classes, is Maria Child was maybe suggesting that there were pacing problems and need a little reorganization, so that's what she did. So, and then, as I put down there, Jacobs' own voice. So Maria Child, not only as a great writer herself, as a great editor, but as a woman, knew that the most important thing was to let another woman tell her own story. So that was really wonderful then what happened there. Okay, great. So this is, of course, to sort of get back into the grand timeline of what we're looking at. In 1852 and 1853, Harriet Jacobs had contacted Harriet Beecher Stowe. The correspondence didn't go well, and probably we're glad that it didn't. It may have been a little bit of the catalyst for Harriet Jacobs to take on the project of writing it herself rather than allowing someone else to write the story for her. She writes it from 1853 to 1858. Her daughter copies and proofreads it, basically. Then Harriet Jacobs tries to get it published, but she can't. Eventually, a publisher says, have Maria Child be your editor and write a little short introduction, which is exactly what happens, and then we'll publish it and sell it. So that's wonderful. So now we're in 1860, and so as it says here on this slide, let's talk just a little bit about a discussion of political events nearing the books being published. So 1860, they have, and actually it's sad and strange. What happens is in 1860, Lydia Maria Child and Harriet Jacobs, the manuscript is all done. They've got a publisher, everything's set, and then that publisher in Boston goes bankrupt right before they print the book. And actually, Maria Child, I think, helped financially to ensure that the actual plates, which were produced then, were able to print the book through another publisher. So then it gets published. Now, there are sometimes when you look around on the internet and you'll see a lot of information about Harriet Jacobs, about incidents in the life of a slave girl. And I like to sort of look around and see what's out there before I teach something, to see what kind of good information and what kind of misinformation is out there. And sometimes the misinformation is out there that this was a best-selling book, in 1861. And that's not true. It's a book that's very popular now, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, but it did not sell, in great numbers when it was first published. We're going to talk about that right now. So that second question, what was going on in the country just prior to its publication? So think about this momentarily, even if you're not a history buff. So the time period we're talking about is late 1860, and then in the first 2 months of January and February of 1861, the book gets published. Lydia Maria Child has helped to circulate review copies. They get several favorable reviews printed in different newspapers, and the book does not sell well. It's received well. People who read it are like, oh, this is wonderful, and there are reviews about it, but it doesn't sell well at all. And why is that? What's going on? Well, it's really simple. And so let's take just a moment to talk about what's going on, in late 1860 and early 1861. So we have here in November of 1860 is when Abraham Lincoln is elected for the first time, obviously. And I don't want to talk about these things too much because I don't want to go off on too much of a tangent. But by the very next month, in December of 1860, the first state to secede is South Carolina. And you can see on the map there that the states in orange there are numbered according to when they leave the Union. So South Carolina is the first state to secede from the Union. Mississippi follows immediately after that. This is in January of 1861. Mississippi, and then Florida, and then Alabama, and then Georgia, Louisiana, and finally, I think Texas delays a little bit because, if I'm not mistaken, Governor Sam Houston was smart enough to recognize that if it came to civil war, he believed that the North would win, and so he didn't want Texas to secede. Anyway, so all of these things are happening. All of these states are seceding. February of 1861, the Confederacy is formed. In March, Lincoln is inaugurated. And you might, just as a little side note, we might remember historically that Lincoln was not pushing for the end of slavery. He did not campaign on that. In his inaugural address, March 4th, 1861, he in fact stated that he's not trying to end slavery, but he was against the expansion of slavery in new states that were coming in the West and the South, Kansas, all of those other places. So, but anyway, to get back to Harriet Jacobs now, think for a moment. The book is published in early 1861. She's got this great editor who not only did a fabulous job of editing it, writes an introduction, and Lydia Maria Child even complained at the time about the fact that the anti-slavery newspapers and journals were not picking up on the importance of Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. It was not receiving the attention that Lydia Maria Child wanted it to. And why is that? Well, it's really simple. Think about this. Think it's January or February. Even if, say, for example, you're a Northerner, you can tell when you read Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, the first thing you read is the preface by Harriet Jacobs, really short, and then the introduction by Lydia Maria Child. And in both of them, the very first page in the preface by Harriet Jacobs, she says that she's doing this. One could also actually say that not only is this an autobiography, it's a memoir, it's a slave narrative, but it's a piece of engaged political writing. Because what Jacobs is doing, literally on the first pages, she's saying, I believe, I do earnestly desire to arouse the interest of the women of the North. So Jacobs is telling her story as a woman. She specifically points out that her readership are women in the North. Now, again, to think about why this didn't sell, why it wasn't an immediate bestseller or something like that, it's January, February, March of 1861. People are reading. The newspaper business is huge by the 1860s. From the 1830s to the 1850s, with a just explosion of daily newspapers in the United States. So there are plenty of newspapers, but the only thing anybody's interested in the whole country, whether you're a liberal who lives in upstate New York, or whether you're a Southerner down in Alabama or Mississippi, the only thing anybody's interested in is political events. What's going on? What state just seceded? In April, the Civil War begins, the Confederate attack of Fort Sumter in South Carolina. So just think about that. At that time period, in the spring of 1861, how many readers are going to be interested in getting into this anti-slavery slave narrative, despite the fact that it's written very well and that it's a great work of art. So, okay, moving on. Now, what I want to do is just shift gears here. And as I said, I wanted to, not only in this video, just give a contextualization of the composition, publication, even the reception of Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, but what I want to do is look only at chapter 1, and we're just going to look at 2 quick passages there in just a minute to sort of give you, if you've never read this before, I want you to be able to just dive right into it and feel like you understand a little bit about Edenton, North Carolina. So we'll talk about that for one moment. And then also we'll talk about this really important person who's so central to the story itself. Harriet Jacobs' maternal grandmother, who everyone in the story refers to her as Aunt Martha. So her real name is Molly Horniblow. And we'll talk about her in just a moment. We're going to actually look in chapter 1 and look at 2 quick passages to sort of get the ball rolling on reading the story itself. My last question there, what was Edenton, North Carolina like? So this is where everything takes place. until her escape to the north, obviously. But what was Edenton, North Carolina like? And it says in the first half of the 19th century, a busy port town. And here I want to turn again to, I'm going to read you another really short excerpt from the same woman, the Princeton history professor, Nell Irvin Painter. And so this is just a description by Nell Irvin Painter of Edenton in the early 19th century. So, Edenton served as an administrative center for its own Chowan and surrounding counties and as northeastern North Carolina's main port. In 1820, the population numbered 1,261, of whom 600 were white, 500 enslaved, and 67 free black. During Harriet and John's youth, John being Harriet Jacobs' brother, during Harriet and John's youth, Edenton was still vibrant enough as a trading center that the town's leading families would station members in the New York area. Now, this will be really important to understanding some facets of incidents in the life of a slave girl as you get to about halfway through, and indeed in the last, third of the book, to understanding that what, as she says, that Edenton was still important enough as a trading center that the town's leading families would station members in New York. The Treadwells and Blunts in Brooklyn, New York, who made the Jacobs' later residence there unsafe, belonged to Edenton's merchant families. And then she goes on to say that in 1819 and 1820, Edenton rated 2 visits from the President of the United States, James Monroe, and in 1820 the town offered him a banquet prepared by none other than Molly Horniblow, the region's finest chef, at the Horniblow Inn, the local elite's gathering place. So again, that was Nell Irvin Painter, the Princeton historian, describing how Edenton, North Carolina, although it's it wasn't large, it's only about 1,200, 1,500 people, something like that. It was a busy port town. And then as she said there, in 2 successive years, Edenton received 2 visits from the President of the United States. And that provides a nice little segue into talking just a little bit about this important person in the first half of the book. And the reason that I want to do this, so we're going to go into Harriet Jacobs' maternal grandmother, Molly Horniblow, who is referred to as Aunt Martha or Aunt Marthy in the book. And so we're going to answer these 2 questions, which are listed here. Who were grandmother Aunt Martha's parents, and what did grandmother do for a living? Now, you can, just in looking at chapter 1, you could answer those, and you could answer them quickly. And if you didn't read chapter 1 thoroughly or slowly, you might miss kind of what's important here. So, and just so we're clear, you can read, anyone can read the entire full text of Harriet Jacobs' Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. You can read it free online, either through Project Gutenberg, through the University of North Carolina at Charlotte Library System. You don't need a password. You don't need anything. It's free. You could also listen to the entire thing through LibriVox. There's a free audiobook of it. And there are going to be links to all of those things, links down below in the description. So let's do that right now. Let's go to the University of North Carolina site, and we will read just a couple really short passages. So here they have scanned in the book spine and the title page right there. And we'll go on down to, as I said, the preface. And as she says in the preface there, this is what I was trying to quote earlier. I hope I did it correctly. So this is why I'd like to say that this is not just a memoir, an autobiography, a slave narrative. It's also a piece of engaged political writing. I do earnestly desire to arouse the women of the North to a realizing sense. And then Lydia Maria Child's introduction, she says something similar to the importance. And Harriet Jacobs throughout the book will say several times, Northerners. She'll make a direct address to Northerners. But we're going to go to chapter 1, and we're just going to, I wanted to try to answer really quickly those two questions I posed about who were, so Aunt Martha is the woman that is Harriet Jacobs's grandmother, and that's what people in the town call her throughout the story. And we're going to try to answer those two questions just about who were her parents and what did she do for a living. So let's take a quick look here. So again, this is chapter 1, and we're just going to look at this passage right here. So again, chapter 1 of Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. So I had also a great treasure in my maternal grandmother, who was a remarkable woman in many respects. She was the daughter of a planter in South Carolina who, at his death, left her mother and his 3 children with money to go to St. Augustine, where they had relatives. It was during the Revolutionary War, and they were captured on their passage, carried back, and sold to different purchasers. Now, if you read that quickly, or even if you read it slowly, you might have missed what she just said there. She was the daughter of a planter in South Carolina. Now, we don't use the word planter very often anymore. That doesn't mean a farmer. What that means is someone who owns a plantation. What that means is a white wealthy man who owns a plantation. So the father of Harriet Jacobs' grandmother is a wealthy white man who has had children with one of his slaves. Upon that man's death, he frees the mother of his children. They leave to go to St. Augustine, so that's Florida. They leave to go to St. Augustine. They're illegally captured, and then it says at the end of the highlighted material there, when grandmother was a little girl, she was captured and sold to the keeper of a large hotel. And then it takes Harriet Jacobs' grandmother to Edenton, North Carolina. Good. So that's just kind of important to sort of understand about, the initial circumstances, and also to, I kind of wanted to point out a couple of things about her grandmother. Okay. Great. Now, the second thing was just about, we're going to talk about what, the second question that I posed up there was something about what Harriet Jacobs' grandmother did for a living, and so we'll look at that in a second. So first of all, so this next passage that we're looking at, again, still in chapter 1, as this will help you to a little bit. This little passage here is important, and it's so easy to just not even notice it. And even I've read the book, I don't even know how many times, and done research on it, and still it's actually complicated to parse out. So this is Harriet Jacobs describing when she learned that she was a slave, and she's going to say something about her mother, her mother's owner, and her grandmother that we just heard about. So, such were the unusually fortunate circumstances of my early childhood. When I was 6 years old, my mother died, and then, for the first time, I learned by the talk around me that I was a slave. Now, she says my mother's mistress, and so, to be clear, mistress is female owner of a slave. So, my mother's owner, this is complicated, and it's really hard to untangle and wrap your head around. My mother's owner was the daughter of my grandmother's owner. She, my mother's owner, was the foster sister of my mother. So she's talking about her mother as a little child and her mother's owner, who was also a little child, little white child. And then she says they were both nourished at my grandmother's breast. In fact, my mother had been weaned at 3 months old so that the babe of the mistress might obtain sufficient food. Now, people often sort of skim over that and they don't realize that's not figurative. That's literal. She's saying that Harriet Jacobs is explaining how her mother, as a little child, was pulled away from her own mother's breast so that the little white child could, be nourished. So, very kind of hard to understand, and it helps to it helps to make sense of the fact that the familial relationships are so complicated, and so that woman that she's talking about is going to be, as you get into the story, that's going to be Mrs. Flint, the very unpleasant wife of Dr. Flint. And we'll see Harriet Jacobs's grandmother refuse to dislike Mrs. Flint, even though Aunt Martha, grandmother, really is the half of the story in the first half of the book is a battle between Aunt Martha on the one hand and Dr. Flint. Dr. Flint being this wealthy, white, powerful medical doctor in Edenton, and grandmother who at that point in the story isn't even freed yet. She doesn't get her own freedom until 1828, I think. So okay, great. So and just really quickly, so what did grandmother Aunt Martha do for a living? And just so we're kind of clear, as you know, as autobiography, sometimes when the writer in the first couple of chapters doesn't explain things the way they will later on. And so in the first couple of chapters, it'll just say something like, my grandmother cooked crackers for the town. And then as you get further and further and further and get all the way, towards the end of Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, you realize how powerful grandma is, and that she's not just cooking crackers, but she owns a large home right in the middle of town, and she has a very successful catering business. She's considered to be the finest chef in the region. So she's a caterer. She has a bakery. She even, as we'll see later on, we learned some things piecemeal about her. She has some livestock. She even apparently owns at least one rental property. So great. Well, so that hopefully we're going to wind things down in the next 5 minutes. And I would hope that has just helped to basically give you a sense of the context, and also just looking at those two passages really early on in chapter 1 to help you be enthused about reading this, because it's such a wonderful book. It really is. Now, so I think it would be nice to end this, because again, I'm not at all intending to summarize the entire book. I'm not intending at all to analyze the entire book or to go into Harriet Jacobs' life. The woman that's mentioned in the very bottom bullet point there, Jean Fagan Yellin, has a wonderful autobiography of Harriet Jacobs, which you could read if you wanted to. The best thing is to just read Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. So hopefully I've catalyzed that interest. And so what I'll sort of end this video lecture on is something that's really so if we think about maybe it's just me and I like to think about how fate and circumstance are so tenuous and strange, that Harriet Jacobs reached out to Harriet Beecher Stowe. It didn't work out well, and that's a good thing. Harriet Jacobs was then decided to write the book herself, did so in secret in 5 years while living and working for Nathaniel Parker Willis, who, by the way, was considered this great writer at the time, was very well paid, was very wealthy, kind of a jerk. He published pro-slavery. He published a pro-slavery apology. And his wife, Nathaniel Parker Willis, when you get into the book in the second half of Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, he's there because he is Harriet Jacobs' employer. They're referred to he's referred to as Mr. Bruce. So it's Mr. and Mrs. Bruce. And his wives, he has one wife that originally hires Harriet Jacobs as a nanny. The first Mrs. Bruce is what she's referred to in the story. And then after that woman dies, Nathaniel Parker Willis marries another woman, and that woman also then later on will employ Harriet Jacobs to take care of her child as well. So anyway, so to sort of wind things down, we'll talk just about the strange reception of this book. So as we said before, it was published in 1861 in Boston, received well, but didn't sell well. Published in 1862 in London. Now, there were 3 original manuscripts. Harriet Jacobs, the original manuscript that she wrote, over the course of 5 years from 1853 to 1858. Her daughter, Louisa, then took that manuscript and recopied it, correcting the spelling, correcting punctuation, things like that. Then that corrected copy was then given to Lydia Maria Child, who, remember, took on an editorial role in 1860. And Lydia Maria Child then made these, what I characterized as smart, but sort of a light touch as an editor. So just little things that would help Harriet Jacobs' own strong, powerful voice as a writer to come out. Now, so it doesn't sell well. We talked about how early 1861, the Civil War breaks out. People are not as interested in reading a slave narrative. It's not read, basically. Read just a little bit, but it's sort of just almost kind of forgotten for about 100 years. Sometime around 1960, 1961, it's republished again. And now, as they say there in that fifth bullet point, so weird. In the 1960s and 1970s, when people started to reread Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, about 50 years ago, it was erroneously thought to be a work of fiction, because Lydia Maria Child had written so much in her life that people looked at this and they were like, this can't be real. This isn't a real story. This is some, anti-slavery, pro-abolition novel that Lydia Maria Child wrote. And so that's what people thought in the 1960s and 70s. And then this woman, Jean Fagan Yellin, began to do research. She was going through Amy Post letters, and she eventually, sort of a happy ending to the story. She then eventually, over the next decade, in the 70s and 80s, Jean Fagan Yellin did all kinds of wonderful archival research and showed that, yes, this is a true story. Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl by Harriet Jacobs is true. And it was not, in fact, a novel by Lydia Maria Child. So that's wonderful. And then, by the late 1990s is when Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl begins to be adopted into, the college curriculum. So great. Well, I hope that succeeded in really just sort of giving you a basis for understanding the context of the publication, and hopefully just get you enthused about reading it, because it's really such a wonderful book.